course or tutorial, if you will, on pairing cocktails with food. You know, everybody knows about pairing wine with food, obviously. It's been done for many years, but more with the resurgence of craft cocktails, um, the thought of pairing cocktails with food hasn't been so prevalent. So I thought this would maybe be a little bit more interesting, even though wine pairing is also an interesting subject as well as beer pairing as well, which depending on time, maybe I can get into a little bit about that. But today we're going to be trying to be focused primarily on cocktails and food pairing. So just for a brief overview, hopefully you all can see this here. So we have the basic anatomy of a cocktail is going to be an alcohol, sugar, acidity, and bitterness. You need all these components to create a balanced cocktail. A lot of the time, people, at least here in the United States, they think, oh, I don't taste the alcohol in my drink. Well, that's sometimes a good thing because it means that the cocktail is balanced because you're trying to get all the flavors in that cocktail, not just the overwhelming taste of the gin or the rum or the whiskey, what have you. You really want to have balance. And what adds balance is acidity. It's going to be that lime juice, that lemon juice. It's going to be sweetness to balance that acidity. So you're going to want to have some, be it agave or simple syrup or some sugar to balance out the acidity and to go well with the alcohol. So we'll, kind of briefly review that. I want to mention the components to consider with not just the cocktails, but with the food. So we're going to want to consider the preparation of it because it's a lot different if a food item if it's a stew versus if it's a grilled meat versus a braised beef. Depending on how you cook the protein or the main component of the dish is going to really, depend on how you want to pair that cocktail to go with it because it's going to add a smoky flavor if something's grilled versus if it was a boiled protein. The intensity of the flavor of the food and also the texture of the food too, because some dishes obviously like a polenta is going to be a lot creamier than some other dishes, than a fried rice. So you want to take that into consideration when you're pairing these cocktails. The other components of food to take into consideration are going to be salt, acid, sweetness, fats, bitterness in foods, and also the heat or the spice of the food. That plays a big component because depending on the alcohol intensity depending on the proof of the alcohol, it's going to play in with the spice. So if you get too high of an alcohol level, and then you have too high of a heat, they're not going to go well together. All you're going to taste in your mouth is basic fire, and that's not good for anybody. What we're really looking for is a nice synergy between the beverage and your cuisine. And then actually we'll get down to just the pairing part of it as well. So this is the main component, obviously, of today's class. So we want to talk about techniques such as comparing flavors, contrasting flavors, the body, the flavor, and the proof of the alcohol when it's in the either straight or mixed spirit. The regions, that's another technique, as in what region plays with the alcohol itself, the cocktail, and how it plays with the food pairings. You can also pair cocktails and alcohol by base spirit with the food or with the food ingredient to the alcohol. So we'll review all those today, and that's today. So let's get started. Excuse me, I'm taking a look at my notes as we go through this today, but love to hear if you have something in the chat. I'll try to get to you as best as I can. So when pairing straight alcohols, it's very important that you remember that you're dealing with a lot of straight alcohol, and it's intense, the proof level. So if let's say you're hosting a dinner party, you want to make sure that either you're serving a couple beverages that can kind of go with everything, or you're serving much smaller quantities. I've actually made this mistake myself. I hosted a dinner event, a rum party, a rum paired dinner, as opposed to a wine dinner. We thought we'd make something kind of fun. We did it in Arizona. It was a 7-course paired, small bites menu, amazing. Unfortunately, though, we didn't probably scale down the cocktails as well as we should have. And by the end of the night, everybody was pretty intoxicated. So when you do that, though, as you become more intoxicated, or your guests, if you're doing this in a hospitality setting, you kind of lose the flavors. You quit tasting things. You're just kind of numb to everything, and it kind of, misses everything. So just take that into consideration if you're, hosting a dinner party or you're doing this in like a professional setting, that you want to take the alcohol content into consideration. Hard alcohol can loosely be divided into 2 groups. You have grain-based alcohol like vodka, gin, whiskey and bourbon, scotch, as those are all based off of barley, rye, wheat, their production ingredients. And then you have fruit or non-grain ingredients such as brandy, tequila, and rum. With those differentiations, they kind of depend how, excuse me, a loss for words, how the acidity levels affect the alcohol spirit. In general, alcohols aren't as acidic as, as a wine would be, but that is to take it in consideration when, you are pairing. We'll get into that later, but the base ingredient is going to be a factor when you're thinking of these pairings. As with wine, there's a huge range and variety with heavily influenced. The ingredients are heavily influenced, and the products heavily influenced by the distillation process, the location, soil, water, and how it's aged, or if it's aged at all. Like most vodkas aren't going to be aged, if not all, or gin for that matter. So just a couple of considerations to take. So as we get into it, we have the basic anatomy of a cocktail, as I mentioned previously. So you have alcohol, sugar, acidity, and bitterness. So great cocktails, I forgot where I saw this, but great cocktails are the building blocks of a great ingredients. Those ingredients include alcohol, sugar, acidity, and bitterness. A thorough understanding of these primary elements can help craft the best cocktails and make drinks with a minimum of waste of trial and error. So basically, if you know that you need all these components, that's where you start. That you need at least all these components to get to a proper cocktail, and it should help you minimize what your the trial and errors. Didn't phrase that quite right, but I think you understand what I mean. Cocktails date back to the earliest parts of the 19th century, and originally contained no real acidic elements. Typically, it was just alcohol, a base ingredient, and then it was sugar of some form and water. But by 1862, some of you may or may not know, Jerry Thomas, the famous Jerry Thomas, came up with a cocktail book, and he put entire sections in his recipe book for sours, fixes, daisies. He's kind of known as the father of mixology, if you will, like, the first original bartender, if you will. And certainly the use of spirits and acidity dates back, farther than that, but he was the first kind of to pioneer and really express that it should be a component into your cocktails. Now, the base is generally going to be a spirit on which the cocktail is based, such as vodka, gin, rum, whiskey, what have you. And then we need also a modifier ingredient, which is added to the base to give a desired flavor or texture. Think of it like, a modifier like vermouth, fruit juices, or the acidity, like we said we needed, the lime juice, the lemon juice, orange juice, perhaps, to kind of balance things out. Lactose is also a form of acidity, so you can get that in cream. And then also textural elements. So that can include eggs. So when you do a dry shake, for those of you familiar with the term, or with using egg white in cocktails, basically you're looking for a textural element. So to do that, kind of an offshoot of this little lesson, if you will, for those of you not familiar, to do egg whites in a cocktail, use a dry shake technique. Dry shake is essentially mixing all the liquid ingredients together and just the egg white of a egg, and shaking very aggressively for, I don't know, probably about 20-30 seconds. That's going to produce a foam that's really nice in a cocktail. Then you add the ice, and then you do a secondary shake, not quite as aggressive, but that's actually to chill the ingredients. And then when you finish, you have a nice foamy, velvety cocktail that really goes, that's nice. And that textural element actually adds to the cocktail pairing, because sometimes if you have some fried foods, a nice contrast to it could be that you have this foamy texture with the cocktail, be it gin sour or something like that, something with an egg white, excuse me, or and then you have it with like a fried food, like a fried chicken or other fried foods fried fritters, and the creaminess really contrasts the fried texture quite nicely. But we'll get into that a bit later. Apologize, just looking at my notes here. So we want to consider the alcohol content, as I touched on before. Another aspect is when we think of wine, most people know that you should aerate wine. And why do you aerate wine? Well, you let the oxygen into the wine, and that kind of opens up the bouquets, the flavors, the sense of the wine. It really lets it breathe, so to speak. We can do that with alcohol as well. What you do is you actually add a splash of water, or you add maybe an ice cube or two. I personally prefer my whiskey with like one large ice cube. It melts slower with the larger cubes, but it also adds more flavor to it, which is quite nice. So if you're doing a cocktail pairing, you probably want to think of that as it adds that element that you really want to go for, and it helps overall. You want to keep in mind that alcohol levels, as touched on before, either the portion or maybe water down the cocktail, so to speak, a little bit, so that people can get through the whole dinner without over imbibing. Mixed cocktails are less strong, so often we're going to have non-alcoholic mixers in the cocktail. So that's another way of kind of getting around just serving straight alcohols, which could be a little aggressive. With a mixed cocktail that has orange juice or some sort of fruit juice in it, the overall alcohol content goes down, and then you could serve more of them in theory. So before we get into the pairing of the cocktails themselves, a few basics to discuss in regards to food. So we know at the basic level that food is going to include sweet, sour, fats, and also spicy, umami, which is kind of that mushroom, hard to describe flavor. But when we're pairing alcohols, you really only want to consider a few things, but they need to be taken into consideration when you are trying to match these two things: salt, acid, sweetness, fats, bitterness, and heat or spice of the dish. Very important to think of the food and not just this goes with that. I know that these two ingredients go together. The texture and all these are an important role. So salt flavors in food counters acidic flavors in alcohols and cocktails. So you want to know that they become less acidic with salty foods. For example, think of lime juice in a margarita. There's a reason it goes really well with salted tortilla chips, or even the salt rim on the margarita itself. The acidity and the salt work really well together. We have acidity, which I've touched on a couple times. It plays a bigger part, obviously, with wine pairing versus alcohol pairing, but it's worth mentioning. Acidity exists to a certain extent in all food dishes, especially tomato dishes, and many salad dressings, obviously, with the vinegar. So when you match acidic food with acidic cocktails, they can actually nullify each other and mute the acidity overall. This doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. It's desirable, and it enhances both the enjoyment of the cocktail and of the dish itself. Sweetness. We want to have sweetness in either the food or the alcohol paired with it. Sweetness in either the food or alcohol paired with an acidic counterpart increases acidity at times. So sometimes you need to avoid sweet and acidic flavors together. the example we have would be like toothpaste and orange juice. So an example of this would be like why more beers with natural sweetness work well with desserts compared to some wines. The acidity in wines is typically higher, so doesn't always work with the sweetness. However, the same effect of acidic food with acidic beverages can happen when you pair sweet with sweet. So think of a dense chocolate dessert and a chichi. So I don't know if everybody knows what a chichi is. Chichi is essentially a pina colada with vodka instead of the rum. So it's going to be the creme de coco, the pineapple juice, which is acidic as well. But that creme de coco is the main driver on that. You can see how the sweetness of the cocktail can balance out with the sweetness of the dessert and vice versa. So in that situation, it could balance each other out well. But kind of the only way to really deal with that is trial and error. So you must just work on to see what works best for you. And actually, I should have stated this at the start of this whole thing. Everything is on what you enjoy, what you and your friends, family enjoy to drink. I've actually been to places that have been kind of looked down upon of the pairings that I made for my wine and my meal. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm paying for it. This is what I enjoy to drink. So, don't worry about what other people think, or if somebody thinks that this is a bad pairing. If you enjoy it, drink it. Eat it. This is your life. It's too short to worry about what other people think. So I always just take recommendations from others with a grain of salt, and I appreciate it because it kind of sometimes it helps cut to the chase for me. So if somebody else already tried something and it was a great pairing, fantastic. I probably will like that too. However, there might be things that I enjoy, as everybody's palate is very unique based off of what you grew up eating. You have favorite foods in your home country, and I have mine from where I grew up. We're gonna have those memories and fond memories of those cuisines and those drinks. Those are the ones that we're gonna base our relationships with. So with that being said, that's I'm gonna pair things. I grew up in California, in the United States. I like seafood with certain cocktails and a lot of beer, and perhaps you grew in a different part of the world that doesn't have fresh seafood, so you don't really enjoy those cuisines, or you don't like those kind of flavor profiles, which is fine. But I'll get off my subject there. I just want to mention, at the end of the day, life's too short to drink, to not enjoy what you're drinking based off of what others might have recommended, what others might say. Fats, we're going back here. So fats, acidic beverages do cut through fat, just like tannins do in wine, which makes, how should I put this? For those not familiar with tannins, tannin is the bitterness. It's the bitter flavor in iced tea, if you have that in your country of origin. So it's that bitter flavor in coffee and tea. So with that, and then obviously in wine. So if you get a nice juicy steak with high marbling, high fat content, the tannins almost wash your palate out from being coated with fat. So if you think about it, you're eating a steak, your palate, your tongue gets coated with a layer of fat. What the tannins do is kind of wash those flavors out and refresh your tongue, refresh your palate, so that when you take that next bite, all those flavors are fully, are full. I apologize for that. With cocktails, you do that with acidity. So if you have a properly balanced cocktail with maybe exceeding acidity or just some acidity in it, take a mojito, for instance, there's going to be lime juice in there. The lime juice can act like a tannin and also wash out your palate. So that's kind of what that's referring to. Lastly, another component with the foods that we're worried about is spice, herbs, and heat. So there's fundamental differences between spices, herbs, and heat. For our discussion, we're basically discussing heat as in the kind with the capsaicin, the the heat from chili peppers, hot chili flakes, the actual spice that makes you sweat a little bit. That's what I refer to when I'm saying spice. Now, heat intensifies alcohol, and alcohol penetrates your tongue and lips and acts like a solvent, which can open up your senses to even more heat. So, what that means is the higher the alcohol, the higher the spice you're going to feel. So, if you have a high alcohol bourbon whiskey, Scotch whiskey for instance, and you're eating hot wings, I don't know if that would be the best pairing, but if you were to try that, the heat from the high alcohol, let's say you have a 90 proof bourbon whiskey, and then you take a bite, take a sip of you have your high proof whiskey, and then you have some hot wings. Those two things come together, really, you're going to explode in your mouth. And maybe you like that, but heat is really intensified by high proof. So you just want to be careful of that when you're considering that. Another example I have here is, if you think of a higher proof alcohol, red wine, for instance, with spicy salsa, and compare that to like a lower proof beer, you definitely notice, and eat the same food, you'd notice the differences between those two items. So just be careful when you're pairing hot foods and higher alcohol beverages, because it's going to just leave you more vulnerable to the heat. And maybe you like that, which is fine, but you just want to think of that ahead of time, especially if you're trying to plan a party or serving this to others, that you really don't want to be overwhelming your guests and friends with such high intensity heat. So let's see here. Other considerations, you want to consider the food's intensity. Is the food super light or super rich? The texture, intensity food needs to be considered. So basically think of a hearty pasta versus gazpacho. They both have tomato and acidity in it, but one's a cold tomato soup and one's a hot, thick, rich pasta. So that has to be taken in consideration when you're pairing. Also, think of a elderflower martini or against a dense chocolate cheesecake. Would those two probably work together? Elderflower is something I think kind of almost goes with everything, but I don't think it would quite go with a chocolate cheesecake. But again, it's all up to the personal preference. Another consideration is consider how it was prepared. The food was prepared. So I think I touched on it earlier, but basically, was it grilled? Was it steamed? Was it done outside? Was it done on a stovetop? Or maybe it was, the food item was just tossed lightly in olive oil. Is the tomato sauce acidic, or is it more cheesy and like an Alfredo, like a cream-based sauce? These all taking consideration. These need to be taken in consideration when you're doing your pairings. Moving on from there. So once we've established what you're looking into, what works best for foods, we can look more into the techniques at this point. So you want to start with at least at a basic element. This is kind of what I like to do. You can either start with comparing or contrasting flavors. It's the easiest and probably most basic method of doing cocktail pairings or any pairings. A lot of these pairings I mentioned here also are going to relate to wine pairings, and they're going to relate to beer pairings. Excuse me, which might be another a great lesson at a later date. Love beer, and there's so many different kinds of beer. But a lot of these may be familiar to you already, but I'll just review them anyway. But they're good to know and it can be extrapolated to all sorts of methods. So that we've identified the basic taste components, we can play around with comparing. So with comparing, you can play with the sweetness and tartness levels. And let's see here, like we can do, let's say we're going to be pairing baked macaroni, nice cheesy pasta. So we'll start with similar pairing. So we have, let's go opposite, sorry. A drink with high acidity will complement the fat in the macaroni. So again, we kind of touched on that before. You have acidity, which acts like tannins, and it cuts through the fattiness, the richness. So red wine, high tannins with steak. Same thing goes with high acidity and the richness in this macaroni and cheese example that we're using here. So it's a creamy bechamel macaroni and cheese. Well, what cocktail might go with that? Well, actually, a Bloody Mary would go well with that. What's a Bloody Mary? You got Bloody Mary mix and vodka, or you can do Bloody Maria, which is tequila with the Bloody Mary mix. There's tomato juice as the base ingredient of the Bloody Mary mix with spices. Now that spice cuts through fat really well and salty. So let me dial it back. What do you think of when you think of hopefully you know what a Bloody Mary is. Think of the flavors that are comprised in that. So it's spicy, it's salty, and tomato. And I almost, in my mind, the vodka is like a secondary ingredient in that, even though it's the only spirit. The showrunner is the tomato juice, right? Acidic, right? And there could be garlic in there. There's Worcestershire, salty and aggressive. That would be a really nice pairing because it's going to cut through all the fat layers. So think of that drink as, opposites attract because they're not similar flavors, but they're going to balance each other out really well. And then we go with congruent pairing. So congruent is, obviously the same. So we're going to go with creaminess. So we're using the macaroni and cheese with the bechamel sauce as the ingredient, as the example. So think of a creamy drink. Pina Colada. Okay, Pina Colada is a nice creamy drink. That or a Marble Queen. Again, going back to if you like tequila, you could do a Pina Colada, but use tequila. It's called a Marble Queen. So, with that being said, the creaminess of that creme de coco, or a gin sour, like we said, anything with the creaminess, maybe a White Russian. That might not be the best example, but the creaminess is going to be with the creaminess of the macaroni and cheese, and that's kind of what you're looking for. It's cream with cream, texture with texture, the softness with the softness. It's all again up to you, but that's a way of doing congruent pairing. Somewhere sweet with sweet. So you could pair a port wine with a nice rich chocolate dessert. Why? They're both sweet, right? Sweet with sweet works well. Moving on. Moving on, though. So we have the body, flavor, and proof. So what we're trying to do here is kind of balance. With balancing that, in general, robustly flavored foods match best with distilled spirits. Although many of them have a different range of strengths and tastes, different flavor profiles within a single variety of alcohol, we know that no alcohol is really delicate. Even the most delicate ones are still hard alcohol compared to a wine. They need to mesh with meals body-wise, as in it needs to stand up to it. So you don't want to pair something that's kind of soft with something that's going to be aggressive and overpowering. A aggressive stew, for instance, if you have a light, gin martini, is that really going to hold up to a hearty stew? Let's say a thick, hearty beef stew, okay? Gin has a lot of flavor. Obviously, you have the botanicals. So in theory, that could be a good pairing because you have the gin botanicals, the coriander, the juniper berries, citrus, everything that's going on in the gin. And there's some of those different flavor elements going on in the stew, perhaps. However, that stew with perhaps there's sausage in there, lamb, potatoes, a thick broth, is those going to be the best pairing? There's not really any much acidity in gin, so there's nothing really to cut through the fat of the richness of the stew. So that needs to be taken in consideration, if that makes sense. You really want to just look for balance and marrying of flavors. As stated previously, acidity can cut through fattiness in a food, but you just got to be careful that they balance each other out well. Floral and herbaceous elements in a beverage also can reinforce savory elements or vegetal notes, but the whole thing with that aspect of it is controlling the body and so that one doesn't overwhelm the other. You never want one to be that all you taste is the cocktail, and that all that you taste is the food. Moving on, citrusy cocktails. Think mojitos, greyhounds, and daiquiris are going to work well with seafoods and salads. They also are a palate refresher when getting into heavier dishes. So the reason of these, what's the thing that is in common with these cocktails? Citric acid, right? So the mojito with the lime juice, the greyhound with the grapefruit juice, and the daiquiri with the lime juice. Those are going to work well with the lighter seafoods and the salads. Again, though, you want to be careful with the salads, as the vinegar with the acidity may or may not work. It's kind of a taste and see kind of thing. But as there is most often, but there's often lemon juice in salad dressings, it works out really well. So, the whole thing here is experimentation is the key. Higher alcohol, as mentioned before, higher alcohol content is going to increase the spice of spicy dishes. So just be wary of that. In other words, high alcohol levels means it's difficult to access subtleties of aroma and flavors. So with that in mind, if you're pairing things, you want to pair lower proof alcohols with more delicate foods. So think of a lower proof alcohol, like a mixed cocktail, perhaps, and then, or maybe it's a French 75, and it's there's a little bit of champagne mixed in, so it's a little not quite as strong as like a traditional cocktail, and then pair that with fish or shellfish as a thought. Sweeter drinks such as a lemon drop or a rum and coke or spiked sweet tea can complement spice and salt. So sweetness obviously is going to counterbalance heat. So does salt. Sweet and salty go together depending on where you might be from. If you've ever put the candy M&Ms in your popcorn, that's a real popular thing to do here in parts of the States. It works well together. It's a nice balance on your palate, and it works. Obviously, it's going to work well with meals and cocktails as well. Age. I haven't really touched on this before. Aging is a big factor when you think about the hard alcohol. So obviously, not all alcohols are aged. But the ones that are rum, whiskey, brandy, is going to affect the flavor. When alcohol spends time in the barrel, it picks up additional flavors. That's why they age it. So the more that it's aged, the more you're going to taste flavors like grain, fruit, and flowers, and oak. So those are the flavors that you're picking up from the wood. The lactones. Not the lactones. The word escapes me right now. Basically, it's the oak vanillins that you're getting from the vanilla flavor that you're getting from the oak, and different flavors is when the alcohol is aging. It's the flavors are extruding into the alcohol, so that needs to be taken in consideration when you're doing the pairing. So do you want something that's been aged 20 years to be paired? I mean, you might. However, if you have this really ultra aged tequila, obviously it's going to be more expensive. And typically those are the kind of things that you just drink by themselves and just enjoy for what they are. But if you are trying to pair them with something, you got to think that the flavor is going to be a lot more intense. So with that being said, you need to pair it with something equally intense. I kind of mentioned earlier, tannins. Tannins exist outside of wines in the form of, at least with cocktails, cranberry, pomegranates, and chocolate specifically. So they go really well together with fats, as we've established with the wine, analogy. So we could try using a cranberry and vodka cocktail, pomegranate margarita, or a dark chocolate martini, and you can pair those with those highly fatty items that I touched on previously, like a marbled steak, or even like a duck. Duck's very rich and fatty, amazing. I love duck. So with that being said, those ingredients that have tannins in them naturally, well, they're going to work well, just like a wine pairing would. And again, everything kind of goes back to, that wine pairings, really work well the same as cocktail pairings. Regionality, okay? So we're down here to regionality. So what does that mean? Match your cocktails to local cuisines. If you're ever in doubt, think of the food that you're making and where it comes from, and then think of the alcohol or beverages that come from that region. There's a reason that specific alcohols are created and are synonymous with certain areas, because those are the ingredients that grew there naturally. People over time have always made alcohol wherever they, whatever country, wherever continent you're on, there's some form of alcohol for a reason. So I don't know how long after society started that we had, sustainable food, and then at some point somebody decided to make alcohol, and it'd be interesting to figure it, to research that a little bit, but I digress. So basically, think of what people are eating in that area, and then what they're drinking, and they're going to go well together because the items that they're eating and drinking already grow well together. With that being said, rum is synonymous with the Caribbean. The sugarcane was growing down there. Tequila and mezcal are synonymous with Mexico, because those agave plants obviously grow in Mexico. So why wouldn't Mexican cuisine obviously go well with tequila? Other foods can obviously go well with tequila and mezcal as well. But those two are going to go together perfectly without even having to give much effort to it, because that's where they are grown and are from. If you enjoy sake, obviously with your sushi, then you could try it with other teppanyaki and other Japanese type foods as well. I don't want to belabor the point, but basically it's just try the region's food with the cocktail in question. A Moscow Mule or vodka-based drinks are going to go well with smoked fish and blinis because, again, Russia, vodka, they go together. Also by themselves really well. Spritzes and Negronis and vermouth cocktails. Try it with some aged Italian cheeses. Italy is the birthplace of those drinks. So why wouldn't those drinks, naturally go well with them? Just a couple tips there. And then we get down to pairing by the base spirit and pairing by the food's ingredient. So you can start with the base ingredient. So think of like I mentioned earlier, smoky mezcal, maybe a smoky whiskey, smoked foods. That's going to bring out the depth in like a chocolate dessert, or to go with the congruent thought we talked about before, the smokiness of the beverage with the grilled meat. Those two, as long as they don't overwhelm each other and there's too much smoke in the mouth, they're going to go together really well. It's all up to you if they overwhelm each other. But smoke with smoke, in my book, that's a great pairing, and I really enjoy it. The floral gins are fairly delicate. So think of a Hendrix, which has rose. There's cucumber in there. I can't remember all the different botanicals in there, but it's a nice floral gin. It's good to try that with make that into a martini and then pair that with oysters. The botanicals with the oysters, the brininess, the saltiness, it goes amazingly well. Another suggestion, you could try bourbon and orange, an old-fashioned cocktail. And again, pair it with that richness of that duck. So you have the alcohol cutting through the fattiness of the duck, but orange duck, that's actually a dish, a Chinese dish that's amazing. So, if you think along those lines, they're going to pair well together easily. Also, another recommendation, mint and lamb. So what cocktail is mint? You can do a mojito. Try a mojito with the lamb. Lamb's a pretty rich dish, so you have some acidity there, which the mojito has lime juice, and it'll cut through. But also the mint, mint sauce with lamb is synonymous together, and it's amazing. So if you try it in beverage form, does it work? It's up to you. But I mean, I personally like that as well. Egg dishes and I go back to the Bloody Mary. I really like Bloody Marys in general, so I mention them often. So Bloody Mary again is going to be the vodka, tomato juice, and spices and such. So it's going to go in egg dishes because often, depending on where you're from, we put tomatoes on with egg dishes. So the two flavor profiles are going to go together really well. Moving on though to, you could try building a cocktail around an ingredient in a dish. For example, you could pair an apple dessert with an apple cider punch. Apple with apple. I keep going back to it. A margarita works well with tacos because of lime juice. There's lime. Most often with Mexican cuisine, they use a lot of lime, a lot of fresh lime juice. So if they're cooking that, the carnitas, the pork, or the beef with the lime juice, if you put a drink with it, it's obviously those two ingredients are one's already in the food. So it's easy for you to just find an ingredient that's already in the food and just, find a cocktail that matches that. Works out, amazingly. And not just Mexican cuisine. Think of other cuisines that might use a lot of lime. I'm not familiar with a ton of cuisines, but I know Thai food, which is also spicy, amazing. I love Thai food. Thai food uses a lot of lime juice as well. So if you were to make cocktails, like a margarita would go well with the Thai cuisine because it's the sweetness and the sourness of a margarita and the saltiness and the acidity goes with the heat and the different flavor profiles that you have with the Thai cuisine. So but let me, I digress. So now we've kind of gone through, those are the basic techniques, if you will, of, sorry, I'm just kind of seeing the chat here. There's questions. I'm trying to, I'll try to answer the questions at the end. I'll do my best. It's just trying to get through the presentation here. So those are just kind of some basic techniques that we want to be aware of. And then I'll kind of get into some specifics right now with the different actual alcohols. So cocktail recipes are listed next. So they're going to be kind of traditional. So cocktails in general, you have the base recipe. I was looking something up the other day and I found, 5 different recipes for a cosmopolitan cocktail. So, and that's like that with quite a few different cocktails. How much vermouth do you put in a martini? That kind of thing. So there's the classic, and then you have extra dry and a wet martini, and there's all these different variations. So what I mentioned kind of next is kind of basics, but when you're at home or when you're out and about, again, it goes back to what do you personally enjoy? So a Long Island iced tea, for those who are familiar with that drink, vodka, gin, rum, whiskey, tequila. There's a lot of triple sec, sour mix, or lemon juice and simple syrup. There's a lot of ingredients in that drink. I personally don't like the tequila in that drink. I think it kind of throws it off, but to each his own. You want to be looking at recipes and seeing what you personally enjoy out of it, and base again your pairings off of those cocktails and what you enjoy. A couple other rules to mention before we get farther. Bitterness, carbonation, and alcohol is going to balance out sweetness and fats. Sweetness balances with spiciness and acidity. So I kind of touched on that before. And bitterness is going to emphasize spiciness. So that may not always be the best combination unless you like that flavor profile. So again, what I mentioned next is going to be, these are some pretty traditional versions of recipes. If there's a recipe that you know of that may or may not include one of these alcohols, that's great. I'm just using these as examples that you can understand the principles behind creating your own pairings. So we'll start with vodka. Vodka can be made from a wide variety of ingredients, most typically though grains or potatoes. Laws in many countries are going to, kind of direct it. But basically, it's supposed to, carry very little smell, taste, flavor. But vodka does have its own distinct flavor. Everybody should know that. It is very easy, though, to pair with cocktails um, because it is so versatile. There are so many flavors of vodkas these days. There's even, glazed donut. Um, I've seen chocolate cake. I've seen all sorts of things. I personally just like the straight, tried and true flavors. Maybe like a citron version, lemon flavored or an orange flavored, but I don't stray too much from the basics. Um, for straight plain vodka, you can choose foods like caviar and smoked salmon to pair with it. Again, going back to thinking of the region, what do they eat in Russia, where vodka is from, right? So think of that cuisine, and automatically that type of alcohol, vodka, is going to go really well with it. It's also great with oysters, so kind of cuts through the salinity of it, and then citrus vodka goes really well with fish because often don't we eat fish, with lemon or orange? So those two are always going to go together. A couple cocktails to try: Cosmopolitan, like I mentioned earlier, citrus vodka, lime juice, Cointreau, which is orange liqueur, and lime juice. You can try it with the cheese platter or the shrimp. The acidity in that cocktail is going to, and actually a little bit of tannins from the cranberry juice is going to cut through the fattiness of the shrimp and the cheese. A dirty martini, which is going to be just vodka or gin, vodka in this case, dry vermouth and olive juice. Olives often are on a charcuterie board because olives go well with dried beets. So you could try those two pairings together. You're good with olives are nice with hummus, tortilla chips as well. Just think of how, the olives can kind of play a part with maybe some Mediterranean cuisine, anywhere they have olives and you have the brininess of that dirty martini, it can go well with maybe that. At least try with that type of cuisine. Vodka gimlet, it's going to be vodka and Rose's lime juice. Rose's lime juice or Angostura lime juice is a preserved lime juice. It's sweetened lime juice. So just be aware that it's not a traditional lime juice. It could go well with guacamole, with avocado as well. Think of the flavors though, that pair well with lime. Screwdrivers, vodka orange juice. Orange and ham automatically go well together, so you can put those together. Most brunch foods, so orange juice obviously is served at breakfast time in a lot of parts of the world. So you can think of breakfast foods, and why wouldn't the screwdriver, as the orange juice is the main component of that cocktail, why wouldn't that go well, why wouldn't that go well together? Bloody Mary, I've already talked to Bloody Mary to death, but it's really good. Also Bloody Marys with, just bacon and eggs, frittatas, I think the acidity and the tomato juice, it balances well with quite a few things. Moving on to gin. Gin is also a grain alcohol. Think of it as vodka flavored with juniper berries, essentially. It's got that piney flavor if you're not familiar with gin. It's very, though, distinct. So if you think of vodka having little to no flavor, gin is going to be its brother that has all the personality, that has that piney, that pine tree kind of flavor to it. So other botanicals are often used with it, like coriander, anise, nutmeg, cinnamon, citrus peels. Those all can be considerations when you're trying to do your pairings. Think of the botanicals, as some gins are heavier on some botanicals. You can try to play those off. Most London dry gins are really heavy on the coriander flavor. So with that being said, you can find a dish that's heavy on the coriander. And again, you're going for these pairings that go together really well. It's often it's an English spirit, but it is a unique and wonderful alcohol, and I think I mentioned earlier, it goes really well with seafood. You could try it with scallops, some ceviche, or some sushi as well. So gin cocktails to be on the lookout for. Gin and tonic water, the bitterness of the quinine can balance out some sweetness. So if you have a sweet dish, you can have a gin and tonic, which has some botanicals, maybe like a curry. So you think like a curry has some sweetness to it and some spice. So try a gin and tonic with it. Might work out well. A gin mule. So ginger beer, essentially it's a Moscow mule, but using gin. So you have lime juice, ginger beer, which is just ginger, the root ginger. Um, and they brew it down to a low alcohol form. There's no real alcohol in any ginger beer, so it's safe for kids to drink ginger beer if you're not familiar. It's basically like a sweet, fizzy ginger soda, but it's different than ginger ale. It's going to have a different flavor than ginger ale. I think it's just more gingery, if you will. Think of a more intense ginger ale. That could be ginger beer if you're not familiar with it. Ginger goes really well with grilled lamb, grilled meats. So you can try that again. You can try it with the sushi because the botanicals from the gin, the ginger, at least here in the States, they serve a lot of sushi. They serve all sushi for that matter with pickled ginger. So, I would think in other parts of the world they do that as well. I'm just not as well traveled. You could try that because automatically that the ginger flavors go with that really well as well. Cucumber gin martini, cucumber elderflower liqueur and gin. It's really nice with lighter grains. You can do it with salads. You can do it with quinoa. And going back to a traditional gin martini. So the botanicals in that, what's a typical English cuisine? Fish and chips, fried food. The gin, the botanicals, the herbaceousness of the gin can kind of cut through the fried fish, either through the texture, which is amazing, and then just the flavor of the herbaceousness paired with the fish. Again, there's a lot of citrus peels in gin, so when the citrus from the gin kind of equate to squeezing that lemon on the fish and chips. So again, all up to you as far as what to try, but thinking of just make these thought processes while you make your pairings. Tequila. So tequila is made from the Weber blue agave plant. It's a specific type of agave. Most people might think of tequila as you take it in a shot, or it's kind of like you're on vacation, perhaps at some resort, and it tastes bad. But tequila's been around a very, very long time, and it's quite nice. And they have different versions from silver, which is unaged or very lightly aged, to ultra añejos, which are aged as long as sometimes as long as a Scotch whiskey. So with that being said, the price and also the quality are going to range there. But tequila has its own flavors, as in, that it's kind of herbaceous. It's green flavored from that agave. So keep that in mind when you're doing your pairings. Kind of off subject, but on subject. You really want to probably try all your base spirits before you try to do any pairings with them. Just so you have an understanding of what each spirit's going to taste like on its own before you start mixing it with other ingredients, and then before you start trying to do the pairing. But back to tequila, you could try tequila cocktails like a Spanish Harlem. Spanish Harlem is going to be like a Manhattan, but with tequila, with like a reposado, which is a slightly aged tequila, or an añejo tequila, and sweet vermouth. So it has a little bit different flavor, obviously, than a whiskey would. But it's nice, and it pairs really well, obviously, with Mexican food, as I stated previously, with the region analogy, but can go well with spicy foods, as Mexican foods often are spicier, or other spicy foods like Thai cuisine or even Indian cuisine. Tequila cocktails, a real versatile one. I like margarita. Tequila, Cointreau, lime juice at a basic level, with or without agave. The traditional recipe doesn't call for agave syrup, but I like my cocktails a little bit on the sweeter side personally. Again, it goes all back to personal preference. So, I always add a quarter ounce to a half ounce of agave syrup, But at a basic level, it's just tequila, orange liqueur, be it Cointreau or triple sec, and lime juice for that acidity. So the citrus elements in a margarita are really well. They work really well with like a spiced meat rub, like a flank steak or chili, even barbecue, because it's gonna the citrus acidity of it kind of cuts through some of those layers. Tequila Sunrise, a classic. Sometimes something you see like in an American college movie or something like that from the 1980s. Tequila, orange juice, and then you float the grenadine on the top so it kind of flows down. This one is nice for lightly sauced or glazed barbecue as well. Um, you know, lighter chicken dishes because there's some sweetness with that drink because of the orange juice and the grenadine. It is a sweeter drink, so it does work well with lighter dishes. Tequila sour, tequila, lemon juice, and simple syrup. That's also nice with roasted chicken. Um, let's see here, and then like a spicy pina. So spicy pina is essentially like a pineapple margarita with jalapenos. So you have this like spicy pineapple margaritas are one of my ultimate favorites. You have the heat from the jalapeno and the green herbaceous flavors from it. You have the sweetness from the pineapple and the acidity as well. Some people put a splash of orange juice. I typically don't with that cocktail, but it's nice as well with the orange juice. But it has a lot of different things going on, sweet and spice, and then you with or without salt on the rim. You could try that with grilled fish. It works great. Anything you think of pineapple that works well with pineapple, um, the cocktail is going to obviously go well with that. And then moving on to rum. Rum is made from sugarcane in either two forms, from the sugarcane juice or from after it's been processed from molasses. So you have two forms of rum. You have cachaça, for instance, which is made straight from the sugarcane juice. So the analogy, as my last presentation had, I kind of went over rums, but basically, at a very basic level, you have sugarcane that grows. You cut it down, you squeeze the juice out, you ferment that, distill it, and then you have cachaça type rum or rum agricole. Rum Martinique is another rum like that. And then you have traditional rum, what most people think of, at least probably here in the United States, is going to be like a Bacardi kind of rum, a white rum, or aged rum for that matter, but it's made from molasses. So they cut the sugar cane down, squeeze the juice out, process it however they make molasses. I don't know how you make molasses. Ferment that, and then you distill it, and then it has a different flavor. So the cachaça rums typically have more of a green, fresh nature to them, just by nature because they weren't ever cooked or processed. So, in a nutshell, that's rum broken down for you. But rum is not heavily regulated, so there's a lot of flavors and additives that are sometimes found, especially caramel. A lot of the time, rum manufacturers will add rum to add sugar and add caramel to color it, and it also sweetens up rum. So that's why most people think rum is inherently sweet. It's not by itself. Rum's not any sweeter than vodka or gin. It's just that after they distill it, a lot of manufacturers add some form of sugar to it, and that's kind of what throws it all off. What goes well with that is some of the different flavors, that could be in the rum. It could go well with the rum itself. So that being said, there's vanilla flavors from the aging. There's cocoa. There's allspice, coffee, herbs, and fruits. So any of those items that are in the cuisine would go well with the rum. Obviously it's going to go well with Caribbean fare because think of where most of the rum comes from in the world. It comes from the Caribbean. Well, the food from that area, be it Cuban cuisine, Puerto Rican cuisine, Jamaican cuisine, any of the islands, jerk chicken, that kind of thing, it's going to go well with that kind of cuisine. I've talked about the mojito multiple times, another great cocktail. Rum, mint, and lime juice. Mojitos pair really nice because of the mint and the acidity as well. Think of like Thai food, pad Thai, or some curries as well. The mint and the acidity, the lime balancing with that heat. You have the hurricane, rum, orange juice, pineapple juice, grenadine, kind of an American thing with that cocktail. You could think of that came about in New Orleans in the South of the United States. So you could try Cajun cuisine, which also is a spicy cuisine for those of you not familiar with. That's a Southern United States type of cuisine. So that being said, think of the region and the drinks that grew up in that area, and sweet with spicy are going to go really well together. Daiquiri, classic Cuban cocktail. So think of a daiquiri, it's rum and lime juice, simple syrup. You think of Cuban cuisine, it's a nice pork bojo. It's going to go well with that. The richness and the fattiness of the pork, and the lime again, the acidity and the sweetness balancing out the saltiness of the pork. Excuse me. And then you have like a pina colada, which is, rum, pineapple, coconut cream. I've kind of touched on that before. It's going to go well with basically, think of a textural element to it. So perhaps a creamy coconut soup, or, the opposite, contrast it with something that's like spicy, that has some heat to it. Mexican cuisine, Thai cuisine, Indian cuisine. I only have a couple more to go here, and we're all through. I think I'm running over time. I apologize. Bourbon and whiskey. So you have American whiskeys and Scotch whiskeys, so different bourbon types. Bourbons from the United States, from barley and rye. Different other grains, but and then you have Irish whiskey and Canadian whiskey and Scotch whiskey, obviously. The main difference being, the ingredients, and then also in Scotland, for those of you not aware, they're going to be using peated barley as opposed to the United States. Bourbon, for instance, in the United States has to be by law 51% corn. That's the grain that they use to make it with. But in Scotland, they're going to be using that barley, and then when they dry the germinating barley grains, they use peated fires, which that smoke very acrid, and it gets into the grains. So after they process the grains, it has that smoke flavor in it. So that's why, typically, Scotch flavored whiskey and American flavored whiskeys, you could taste, even you could smell it from a mile away. You're like, oh, that's Scotch, that's American whiskey, just from the smell alone, because of that smoky flavor. I really like Scotch, and I can appreciate bourbon whiskey as well, American whiskey in general. It's just two very different flavor profiles. So when you're trying to do your pairings, you got to make sure that you're making those two distinctions, because there is a lot of flavor profiles in different types of whiskey, and that's whiskey is a whole other class I can go into, but the different types. But at a base level, you do have, basically North American or New World whiskey, and then you have Old World whiskey, which is going to be Irish and Scotch whiskey, which even those two have two very separate flavor profiles as well, as the Irish don't use the peat. But back to the pairings, with the bourbon and American whiskey, you have let's say a mint julep. So a mint julep, think of a mojito, but done with bourbon, sugar, mint, club soda, bourbon. The mint again, mint and lamb sauce. Think of the lamb, so I'd recommend lamb with that. And old fashioned, bourbon, some sugar, orange and maraschino cherries, depending on which recipe you got. Orange goes well with grilled meats, and also the bourbon. The alcohol content can cut through the fattiness of the steak quite well. Manhattans, either bourbon or rye whiskey with that. It has bitters and sweet vermouth. You could try it with foie gras, rather rich, rich foods. Has the bitterness quality of it from the vermouth and from the bitters themselves, and from the whiskey to a lesser extent, is going to cut through the richness of the foie gras or whatever items you choose to pair with it. Think of it like a creamy polenta that actually probably contrast really well. Let's see here. A whiskey, a Washington apple. So you can use Canadian whiskey, apple schnapps, and a splash of cranberry juice. Pork tenderloin, they're going to go really well with that. So think of the ingredients of the cocktail again. There's going to be vanilla from the whiskey. There's apple schnapps that you used. Apple and pork are two very friendly items, so those go together really well. So, you pair them together and it's a very nice pairing. And then moving on to brandy, we have, brandy, for those who are not aware, brandy is essentially distilled wine. That's how they first came up with brandy. So it's synonymous with France, cognac, armagnac, very specific items that can only be made in those parts of France. The brandy can actually be made, regular brandy can be made wherever. Brandy is really nice, as depending on how it's aged, or it takes on a whole different flavors, be it sherry casks or Limousin oak, or whatever kind of oak that they use to age it. Spanish brandy, French brandy, they're all very nice, rich, nice flavors, and they're amazing. As most French cuisine is amazing, the inherently brandy is going to go well with that type of cuisine. So you can just pair those two together quite well. There's vanilla, herbs, dried fruits, citrus, spice, oak, and nuts. Tobacco all come from brandy, so those can pair really well with different creamy sauces, um, roasted duck, fragrant dishes. Anything. You just think of French cuisine in general, and brandy isn't always involved, obviously, but often there's some sauces that use brandy. So why wouldn't you just pair a brandy cocktail with that, or brandy on its own? Brandy sidecar is a wonderful one. It's brandy, lemon juice, and Cointreau or orange liqueur. So sweet and sour. You can try it with French cuisine, as I've mentioned. You can try it with some sweet and sour Asian cuisine. You just have to be wary, not too spicy, because brandy can be delicate. It's a wonderful. There's floral notes. There's all sorts of notes, because since brandy is derived from wine, there's all sorts of flavor elements in it, and then once you age it, takes on a whole different flavor profile. But it's just amazing. So, but it can get delicate. So you got to just be aware that when you're pairing it with food, that it doesn't overwhelm the cuisine. What else do you have? Brandy Alexander. It's brandy, cream, nutmeg, a little bit of creme de coco. It's nice. The chocolate elements and the richness of that can go well with desserts. Can go well with fruit. You know, and let's see what I have left. Scotch. Essentially Scotch whiskey. So I touched on that kind of earlier. So the element of the Scotch whiskey is that it's going to have more peatiness to it. So there's different peat levels, from like a Macallan to something more peaty, like a Lagavulin. Essentially it's all alcohol, but it's the amount of smoke that went into the grain that made the whiskey that's going to make the difference on that. Also, there's the difference of single malt and blended whiskey as well, which creates whole different flavor profiles also. Blended whiskeys typically being a little bit lighter on the palate, because it's a mix of anywhere from 3 to 25 different whiskeys that might go into a blended whiskey, which is kind of crazy. But depending on which Scotch, so this one's, you have to be very delicate or specific on how you're trying to pair this, because there's such a different range of smoke in the whiskey. But you could try sweeter, smoother Scotches with some smoked foods, and then the smokier whiskeys with something like maybe some fish or beef. Like I said before, grilled with grilled, smoky with smoky is kind of nice. Also, you want to make sure that you're adding a splash of ice, splash of water, maybe some ice to kind of get the nuances of that whiskey. To kind of open it up. Like I said, air aerates wine, water aerates hard alcohol. So, like brandy, it's more typically drunk by itself than in cocktails. But by itself, it can go well with sushi. That smoke quality. With the fresh fish, carpaccio, smoked meats, fishes, chocolate, and oysters. As far as any cocktails, we have a classic Blood and Sand. It's a very dated cocktail, but it goes back to it's Scotch, orange juice, sweet vermouth, and cherry liqueur, depending on the recipe you see. So something Cajun, a little bit of spicy can go well with that. Spicy crawfish or shrimp would go well. You have a Godfather, Scotch and Amaretto. So that can, the nuttiness can go well with desserts. Amaretto, the almond liqueur, the nuttiness of that and the smokiness. It's almost like a smoked almond. It's a great cocktail, actually, classic. It can go well with, like grilled meats or something like that, or even a dessert, chocolate dessert. Because think of what, goes well with chocolate. Nuts and then the smokiness quality to kind of balance out that sweetness. Amazing. So I think I went well over my time. I apologize, but thank you everybody for listening. That's kind of all I got for today. Thank you for your attention, and I think that's kind of where we're at. So I think that's it for me. Enjoy the rest of your day, or whenever you're seeing this rebroadcast. Thank you.